Welcome to Practically Christian. I'm Janelle, and I'm here with my husband Luke.
Hi, guys.
And our friend Jake.
Hey.
We share conversations that help you know Jesus more deeply and follow him more faithfully. The truth is, no one has arrived at Christ-likeness. To grow in that direction, we believe that you need authentic relationships and biblical theology applied to your everyday life. We hope you're encouraged to grow and to live out the biblical truths that we will discuss on this episode. So let's get practical and dive into a conversation about lust.
Today we're going to talk about lust, which is the last of our series on the 7 deadly sins. And as we look at it, it's one that is really polarizing in our culture right now because there is, I think in the past there was a lot of like, no, this is bad, and maybe a lot of it happening under the surface. But now our culture seems to be becoming more and more accepting of it. So anyways, this conversation you might be thinking about different things going on in your life and thinking about different culture that or like culture and like stuff you're consuming, different media you're consuming, and thinking about, is that actually helpful or is that just kind of playing on lust, which I think is a big deal. At the same time, we're going to be talking about stuff that sometimes lust, like sloth and gluttony, is connected to coping. And sometimes it's connected to unhealthily dealing with things going on in your life. And so that'll probably come up as well, which is why this one, unlike some of the others, is so multifaceted in what's going on with it. But to start out, what do you think the definition of lust is, especially how you would understand it biblically?
I mean, it has to do with sexual urges. Mm-hmm. And I would say biblically, it's dwelling on sexual urges that are inappropriate and kind of giving into that desire. So it can result in, I would say, outward sin, but it can also still be a sin inside, just like when Jesus said, if you look at someone with lust, you're committing adultery with them in your heart. So I would say a lot of times it ends up having outward sinful behaviors associated with it, but it can still be sin if you're dwelling on it. Apart from that, Would you change or add anything to that?
No, I think I would agree. Like when Jesus says, whoever looks at a woman with lustful intent, and the reverse applies to women as well. But like what I think of is just anything that would be sin to do outwardly and in the real world, to like fantasize about that or to like almost take steps towards that, but in your mind or your heart. Is lust. What would you say, Jake?
Yeah, I think that it's in some sense like the desire for / like the thinking about anything that would be sexually immoral, right? Like the in some sense, like lust is the like preparing for the activity of sexual immorality or wishing for the activity of sexual immorality. And I think those things are often very combined together in how they function. So we talked about, like, we're brought up a little bit, just that culture has been changing when it comes to having discussions about sexual immorality and lust. How do you think the greater culture and Christian culture has changed when talking about lust or thinking about sexual immorality from when you were growing up?
I mean, I think when I went to public school, our sex ed was pretty much just mechanics of sex in elementary school. And then in middle school, I remember it was basically don't get STDs and don't get pregnant when you don't want to be pregnant. That was like, from the cultural standpoint, that was the main lessons they wanted to teach, was like, don't get STDs and don't get pregnant. So they weren't really talking about morality at all. I don't have kids in those phases, and I haven't seen the sex ed stuff from our school district, but I know that like even in like, for instance, in the Girl Scouts handbook, they encourage the girls to experiment with sexuality, and it's almost considered a value to like experiment sexually and just do it safely, but experiment because that's good for you. So I think it has shifted from just like don't get STDs and don't get pregnant to like there is goodness in experimentation sexually. And I think that's gotten even down into the Girl Scout handbook.
So from when you were growing up in public school, it was like this is amoral. It's like it's neither good nor bad. It just is. And then now you think it feels like it's kind of moving into like no, it's actually positive to experiment in this way, not just okay.
Yeah, and I think now it's a lot of questions about like discover your identity through experimentation in the same way that we might say discover your favorite hobbies through experimentation is like discover your sexual preferences through experimentation.
Yeah, I was gonna say something similar. I think the biggest shift I've seen is a general understanding that like while lust is bad but love is good, to more of a recategorizing. I think at least in general culture, Christian subcultures can still be really weird with their understanding of lust and even like a swing away in the bad way. But in general culture, I think it's an extension of like the follow your heart philosophy now includes whatever sexual desires you experience. Follow those as well. And so just like to be authentic means acting out and being true to whatever desires you have, including lustful desires.
Yeah, I think when I was growing up and I kind of tuned out a lot of this stuff from public school, but like there was more of the thought, and I think this transition was taking place, but it was more of the thought of like boys and girls are going to experiment with each other. They're going to like do it safely. And now it's more about figure out what you want to be doing. There's no assumption of what you want to be doing, if that makes sense. Where it was like, before it was like, the assumption is, yeah, you're a boy, you'll like a girl. You're a girl, you'll like a boy. And now it's like,
who knows?
Maybe, who knows what you'll like. Like it's just very much more about discovery than it is about like the idea, like it itself. It's about discovering about it, not so much about like knowing about it. So what about in Christian culture? How has it changed, you think, in Christian culture?
Yeah, I feel like there's a big range in Christian culture. Like I think I think there's been a pushback against the purity movement, which has some validity. So basically, like the classic thing is
weights, code stuff.
Yeah, well, it's
I did that when I was a kid.
I never did. My church tradition did not do the purity culture stuff that was really popular. But I do know like the analogies of like if you chew a piece of gum a bunch of times, like who wants it now? And like that is very damaging because it's basically saying if you had sexual experiences, you're already chewed gum and now you're worthless and you're disgusting, like a piece of gross gum. I think that was really damaging because first of all, it's not Christian to say you screwed up, so you're permanently unredeemable and unwanted. That's not what Jesus had to say. But then also, it doesn't account for people who had unwanted sexual experiences or people who were following whatever the culture said and then became a Christian later. Like it just doesn't even account for different people's experiences. So I'm glad in some ways that there's been a pushback against that. And I think there has been an orthodox pushback, but that I mean there are people who are like still holding a Christian sexual
ethic.
Yeah.
And then there's also the swing that says all that was wrong. How dare they have said, they imposed shame upon me for sexual things and I should embrace my lust essentially. So I think there's two different wings of the pushback camp.
Yeah, I think there has definitely been some healthy pushback to the purity culture, but it's also like the idea of like, and purity is still good.
Yeah.
But I think there is a lot of like, we've seen a lot of like our mainline denominations, like the PCUSA, like the Presbyterian Church of the United States of America. Not all Presbyterians, but one of the bigger groups of Presbyterians and one of the bigger groups of Methodists and some other denominations have swung so far that they're indistinguishable from culture. where they're like, no, yeah, everything, like, just whatever, right?
Mhm.
Yeah. What else?
I mean, this is something I experienced when I was in youth group, and I think is still relatively common in more conservative Christian circles, which is a conflation of attraction and lust, or an inability to differentiate between those. I just remember struggling with that when I was in high school, and still, like teaching CCU students a few years ago, like when I was talking about lust and First Corinthians, actually, we were talking about like lust, but they were like, "Wait, you're saying like it's okay to experience attraction? Like that's not lust?" It's like, yeah, that's not lust. Like I experience attraction towards women who are not my wife. That's not. It's what you do with those feelings that changes whether it's lust or not. But they were like, that just seems like it'd be so easy to cross the line. I'm like, well, maybe if you cross it all the time, but there's a lot. There is a line.
Yeah.
Well, and I think it makes it so that you have to sin. If you include any desire with lust, then it means that that desire that you can't prevent because it springs up without your intention, then you are already sinning.
But I think I in high school experienced shame about experiencing attraction sometimes, and I think some Christians experience that.
Yeah, I think that's definitely more common than we think. And I think that also, it kind of feels a little bit like the Pharisaism, right? Where it's like, let's build this fence that's farther out. And I actually think a lot of like teachers sometimes will build the fence to protect the other people, but then the other people don't realize, like the kids don't realize that it's a farther fence than actually is. And they now think that's the new line, kind of thing. Yeah, I think for me, there's like a very big, and I don't know how much this was beforehand, but the very big shift towards the Christian culture wanting to feel cool about sexuality. And so they want to make it, they want to feel more laissez-faire about sexuality. And they kind of in response to the whole like pushing back against like the shame culture, it's like, you shouldn't feel ashamed of anything. Like, I was talking with Luke and Janelle beforehand about how I've had multiple people from different like states and different like youth groups, like the volunteers, tell me like, oh yeah, my youth pastor said it was okay. Like there's a volunteer for a youth group. Like my youth pastor said it was okay that me and my girlfriend are sleeping together because as long as we don't sleep with anybody else, and as long as we don't, as long as we plan to get married, then it's not adultery. And there's no place in the Bible it says that you shouldn't sleep with each other before marriage. And while I think they're like, no, so side tangent, while there are like no straight up Bible verses that say don't sleep with someone before you get married to them, that's kind of wrapped up in all the conversations about it, and in the discussions about marriage, and in like actually just the word that they use for like for lust and for porneia, or like sexual immorality, like that includes that, and everyone knew it did. But it's interesting that people kind of want to like in some sense make excuses for other believers, for themselves, to kind of like not feel guilty about like sin.
Yeah, it feels so much when, I mean, you could use like a ridiculous counterexample, I guess, of to get at the point that it was just assumed with a view of sexuality. But like, I don't think anywhere can you find it saying like people who are prostitutes should stop being prostitutes. Like you can't find Jesus saying that directly to a prostitute, like stop engaging in prostitution. Like he just welcomed the prostitutes and the sinners and the tax collectors. That's like assumed in this is like that this wasn't okay.
Yeah, I think that might actually have to do a little bit with our Christian misunderstanding that's pretty common that says sin is sin, like all of it separates you from God, and therefore it's all equal. And the same thing is like with sexual immorality. Like sexual immorality is not equal. I'm sorry, rape is different than sleeping with someone consensually. Like those are different.
Which
things.
is different than having lustful thoughts and not doing anything.
Yeah, they're all different. They're all immoral, but they're not the same. Or like attacking a child sexually, like that is on a different level than having lustful thoughts. Or, you know, like they are different. And I think our Christian culture almost wants to say, I don't want to condemn it as utterly evil as it is, because there's a scale.
Yeah.
But I
so
don't want to
yeah.
condemn.
Yeah, I don't want to condemn. So if you are, let's say you're in a dating relationship, you're faithfully committed to each other, you are intending to get married, you still shouldn't have sex. But sex in that context is different than sexual attacks of other kinds.
Definitely. So we are going to read 1 Corinthians 6, 12 through 20. And we're just going to talk about like there's quite a few warnings in here. We're just going to talk about what warning stands out to us. You might have one that stands out to you a little bit differently. So keep track of that, and also do a little bit of thinking about that if you come up with something that we don't. So Paul writes, I have the right to do anything you say, but not everything is beneficial. I have the right to do anything, but I will not be mastered by anything. You say food for the stomach and stomach for food, and God will destroy them both. So Paul's quoting a letter that basically has been sent to him. And so he's saying, like, these are the things you're saying, and I'm responding with what, like, kind of like Paul through the book of Corinthians does this a lot. He says, like, yes, but. Like, yes, what you're saying is true, but this other thing. And so that's when he says, I have the right to do anything. And he says, but not everything is beneficial. That's him responding to that idea. Anyway, so going forward, the body, however, is not meant for sexual immorality, but for the Lord, and the Lord for the body. By his power, God raised the Lord from the dead, and he will raise us also. Do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ himself? Shall I then take the members of Christ and unite them with a prostitute? Never. Do you not know that he who unites himself with a prostitute is one with her in the body? For it is said, the two will become one flesh. But whoever is united with the Lord is one with him in spirit. Flee from sexual immorality. All other sins a person commits are outside the body. But whoever sins sexually sins against their own body. Do you not know that your bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit, who is in you, whom you have received from God? You are not your own. You are bought at a price. Therefore, honor God with your bodies. So from this kind of like long warning, what stands out to you about sexual immorality?
I mean, this is linking your previous question with what's there, but part of what stands out to me is just how different Paul's reasoning is than the reasoning I absorbed in youth group, and that the reasoning I received was a lot of like, do you want your marriage to be amazing? Then be pure. And it was like kind of like this if-then scenario. Almost like a little bit of the prosperity gospel, like if you do this, then this will happen, right? If you remain pure, then God will give you the wife of your dreams, and etc., which is kind of ridiculous looking back. But like Paul never even brings that up. He's like, the problem with sexual immorality is you've been united with the Lord. So be devoted to him first and foremost. It's just very different logic.
Yeah, what's odd to me is I think it's, again, we talk a lot about Gnosticism as a bad thing, but I think Gnosticism actually contributes to false understandings about lust. And again, Gnosticism is where you separate out the spirit and the body, and they're separate things.
The body doesn't really matter.
The body is the clothes, and the spirit is the actual good part.
Yeah. But here in the verses you read, it said the body isn't meant for sexual immorality, but for the Lord. Like your body is meant for the Lord. Your body is a temple. So it's kind of bringing the spiritual and the physical together and saying like these things are intertwined. They both belong to the Lord. So it's not okay to just do whatever you want with your body or give yourself over to sexual immorality because it matters. It's your body. That's you're uniting yourself to someone. And it's not appropriate to do that if it's an immoral sexual relationship.
Yeah, I think one of the things that always stands out to me is the flee part. And I think there's one other place where I think James brings up the idea of flee, but like from temptation, but it's like flee from sexual immorality. And I think a lot of times we have this temptation to try to argue with our temptations. We're like, well, that temptation's not actually that tempting. And it's like, just like Paul's like, no, run away from that temptation. Do not have a conversation with it.
The fleeing thing really brought up for me Joseph.
Yeah.
And so he's working in the house of Potiphar, and Potiphar's wife thinks he's hot and wants him. And so when Potiphar's gone, she tries to get him to sleep with her. And he literally flees. She even grabs his jacket or his coat or
to try to keep him there.
And he runs away without it.
Yeah.
And then she uses that as evidence against him, which gets him thrown into jail. But it's just like the fleeing sexual immorality is like, he didn't just like stand there in the room and say, no, I won't do it. I'm just going to stand here and continually refuse. Like, and what is different about that, the fleeing versus the.
So actually one of the funny things I was like, sometimes like youth kids will ask me like, what do I do when I'm experiencing temptation for lust? And I'm like, well, if it's like when people are still awake, just go sit in the living room with your parents. Like that is the most obvious like way to flee when you're a child and like in your parents' house is like just go watch TV with your parents because I can guarantee you it's probably like it's
gonna not be a turn on to
you're not gonna be able to like access that temptation in the same way. It's like just run away from
leave that context as quickly as possible.
And it's almost, I think when we learned about self-discipline and like resisting temptation is like it wears you down. If you continually are exposed to temptation, it's wearing you down.
Your willpower is pretty limited.
You have limited willpower, so you're if you don't flee, you're basically saying I'm going to stay here until I'm worn down and will give in, which is a very bad.
There's not a very high chance you're going to win in the situation. Like you win by leaving. So also in this passage it says, in verse 18, all other sins a person commits are outside of the body, but whoever sins sexually sins against their own body. So kind of like looking at this, because we've kind of hit it from a couple different spaces where we talked about, hey, the body is important, right? But also, all sin, a lot of people teach like all sin is equal or think that all sin is equal, but Paul seems to be saying there's a differentiation going on here. Maybe not that it's not equal or like, it's kind of weird to try to play like measuring stick with sin, but like, what do you think Paul's trying to get at with this? Like, this sin is against your body, not outside your body. Like, how is this sin different?
Yeah, it's interesting because I've always thought of it as like, oh yeah, like you're sinning against other people, and then this one's yourself. But we just talked about gluttony, and gluttony is
against your body
in a sense. But he says it's not included here, and like this is very different than gluttony, is what he's saying.
Yeah, so it's all other sin is outside the body, but this one. So what's going on?
I think there's something with sexuality that you give yourself over to it in a different way. It doesn't feel as much like I'm being gluttonous right now. I'm doing sexual things right now. Like I think it's like I think God made us so integrated with our sexuality that it's a deeper thing. And for the same reason that it is a bigger deal if someone cheats on you versus does some other sin against you. Like if they stole your money or they cheated on you, like one is going to have a much deeper level of betrayal than the other.
And maybe a little bit of like I kind of think about it like the emphasis on the word in the sentence. It's like gluttony. It's like I am eating right now, where sexual sin is often I am sinning sexually right now. It's like more focused on you and less on the thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think just to build off what you said, Janelle, like I heard a pastor just kind of make the point of like, if anyone comes to you and is like, I want to tell you a secret I've never told anyone before, it's like 9 times out of 10, it's something sexual. And like, it's not interesting that that's like the most raw kind of part of us or sensitive. Or
the shame goes
deeper. And I wonder too if that helps explain kind of like the LGBTQ insistence on like rights and sensitivity about that. Like, I've not experienced like the gender dysphoria. Thank you. But like I know from people's descriptions of how unsettling and how deeply confusing that can be. And then some of this, I don't think it's like the right outlet for that, but I have seen people just be like, like just so deeply, like they are deeply offended when people don't use their pronouns or things like that. But it's like, why is that so sensitive? Well, like it's related to our sexuality, gender, like that's integrated. Just a deep part of us, I think.
Yeah. And there's like later on the passage it says, you are not your own.
Hmm.
And I think that's like very much like the kind of the idea going into like it's very personal when you like sexual sin is very personal because it is so heavily a part of our identities, heavily so part of our like how we're created. That God is saying like, don't destroy you. I bought you for a price, right? So, kind of moving on, what do you think is the most tempting things for people when it comes to lust? Why are people tempted to this? Like, what are the triggering points kind of idea? Not like the individual, like, space of like, oh, they saw something, but like, what emotionally is going on? What?
Yeah, I think there's like a deep longing for good things and it gets twisted. I think that's how a lot of sin works is like there's a good longing for togetherness with someone, like deep union with someone else. I think there's the lie in our culture is like you will be fulfilled if you find your person. So I think that lie is very compelling and like people want to feel fulfilled. They want to feel like their life has meaning and recognition. And then it is mixed up with love, which is deep and good. And again, if it's twisted, it's ugly, but it's, I don't know, all those things are so deep and close to people's hearts and their deep desires for themselves.
Yeah, I think of it as like an artificial version of what like love is supposed to be or offers, like sexuality is this close intimate thing, and it's like a weird I don't know, I want to say it's like a weird like affirming thing, like when you're married, like where you want someone and they want you at that deep level is like oh, at least for me it's like a weird affirming thing. But I think lust offers like a cheap artificial version of that where it's like, oh, you can get like this sort of similar to
it's like
affirmation hit.
Porn is the person that will never reject
Yeah,
you.
exactly. Yeah.
You never have to, and that's in a lot of cultures, and ours is becoming this way. But especially, I think people point to Japanese culture right now, where it's like, I think it's some ridiculous high number of like people who just aren't interested in relationships because they have pornography, and they're like, because that will never reject me. It's not even, and they're like, I know I could have more,
right? But relationships are risky.
But really,
porn is
it's a never fail kind of thing, right? And then in some ways, that's actually like the whole OnlyFans movement, like, or what's going on with that, where people are like paying sexual streamers because they never feel rejection from those people, and that's a real person. It's like active porn in some sense. But yeah, I think the rejection one's really big. I think, and I think that kind of goes into why. It kind of going with like the sexual sin is so personal, and in the same way like sexual sin makes like changes how you feel about yourself. In the moment it makes you feel accepted, and afterward it makes you feel broken in a way that other sin doesn't necessarily make you feel. So what do you think, like, for you slash like for people listening, what has been the most successful thing that you've seen, or maybe a thing that you've seen that helps people deal with lust? Whether there's lust while people are in marriages, there's lust while people are in relationships, there's lust while people are single. Like how would you say, like, hey, what mindset or what thing do people need to work on to fight lust?
I mean, this is like pretty cliche sounding, but I think bringing things into the light makes a difference. So um, having some kind of shame around something you've done or thought, and if it just stays in the dark, it can kind of grow there. I think, and the shame keeps growing too, and it makes it harder and harder to bring it to the light. So I think I would just say bring it before the Lord first, but then also share your sin with someone else and someone that you trust, someone that you're not trying to manipulate into lustful, togetherness in it. Like, make sure you make sure it's what God would want, like the kind of person to share with that would be healthy for you. But then I think bringing it into the light makes a huge difference.
Well, in some ways, like I like to think about it like the sun, like this is like actually just a nature fact. The sun disinfects things.
Yeah.
House lamps do not. So when you bring it to light, make sure you bring it to the sun and not to like a situation where it's like, oh, it's not that bad.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
Interesting.
One of the books I read on pornography and lust like made the point that it's actually similar to what we talked about with like gluttony and hunger versus fasting. But one of the things you learn when you fast is that like the experience of hunger is not like this thing that will just keep getting bigger and bigger until you eat.
Mhm.
That like hunger kind of comes in waves. And this book was like talking about how like actually temptation works very similarly, where if you don't know this ahead of time, it kind of sets you up for failure. If you think, oh man, I'm tempted to look at pornography or fantasize about whatever, like I think I used to feel like this victim of like, well, this temptation is really strong and it's only going to get stronger until I act on
Forever.
it. Forever. And so, like, what's the point of even fighting? Because it's hard to fight now, but.
Well, that's like the phrase like is like let off steam, right? Like I don't know if you've ever heard that. Like people have talked about like I've heard that in like sexual kids. Like, well, you just gotta let off the steam sometimes, and it's like no, actually you don't.
Yeah.
Like
actually, in reality, like it is tempting, but one, flee, like get out of that situation, but also like it's not just going to go up to the right forever. Like that temptation will go down. Like it's a wave. It'll pass. And so, like understanding that.
So do you mean that more in the sense of like in an individual temptation spot, or do you mean like more macro, like over days? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I meant like more, I guess, individual temptation, like the temptation to act on a lustful desire. Like when you experience that of realizing like this is going to be a wave of desire that will pass.
Yeah. So I think that so like one of the helpful piece of advice I like got was like this is like a weird piece of advice, but it's like to ask temptation why. And this kind of goes into like the unhealthy coping spot where it's like often our temptations and often the reason we're weak to certain temptations is because of other things that are going on in our life.
Yeah.
And so I've heard people like talk about like after they've worked through lust and like worked it, that they were like one of the things they were like actually I just really needed physical touch and I didn't get any physical touch in my life, and so my brain said, well, this is a physical touch thing, and Satan used like their need for physical touch as part of a temptation. And so sometimes it's like, yeah, or you're lonely is a very similar one. It's like you're lonely, and it's like, well, figuring out maybe what are some of the things that are going on. What are needs that you have that aren't necessarily sexual needs that might be feeding into those sexual like desires or experience like temptations.
Yeah, that's good.
So, one of the things that I think has been going on, and this is because of, in some sense, divorce culture in America, and also a little bit of like our Gnosticism in America, where it's like, actually, literally, like I could literally hear, like as Paul says, the body is not for sexual immorality, and I could hear a lot of people in America going, no, the body is for pleasure. That's all it's like. And so we've in some sense like degraded what the body's worth and degraded marriage, because most people assume like when people go to weddings, there's a large amount of people who are going like, this will be a nice 10 years for them. Like, you know what I mean? They're like, oh, it's not going to succeed, but it'll be fun for them while it lasts. Not saying that's how everybody does, but I think a lot of people like think about that when they are going to weddings or like about their own marriages. There is like at the same time the Bible has a very strong view of your body. The Bible cares about your body. God cares about your body, and it also God cares about marriage. And so in Hebrews 13:4, it's just like a one-off little like verse near the end of the book of Hebrews where oftentimes the writers of the New Testament will like kind of like chain gun like a bunch of different like little things. And he says, marriage should be honored by all, and the marriage bed kept pure, for God will judge the adulterer and all the sexually immoral. And then he goes on to keep your lives free from the love of money. So very much just like a little bit of like a, hey, here's a proverb tidbit for you to think about. So what do you think it means for a married couple to keep their marriage bed pure, but not just don't cheat? Like, what does it actually mean to keep it pure in that way?
I mean, I think emotional affairs are real and can be deeply hurtful. We had friends whose parents did basically an emotional affair where they were still sexually committed to their wife, but they essentially treated another woman emotionally as the wife, the way that you would treat a wife, and sharing your deep heart with that other person, and how dysfunctional that was in their family. But I do think it's not just about sex; it's also like
intimacy.
Yeah, and your primary intimate partner, especially of the opposite gender, should be your spouse.
And something to watch out for in that space is actually people are more likely to let themselves get away with it with their own children. It's a psychological thing called triangulation, where if your spouse is distant from you emotionally, that you can start connecting with an opposite gender child, and kind of like it's called like spouseification, where you use them for the emotional stuff. But I didn't want to interrupt. Just like there's like it could be like other people outside the marriage. It could also be people you're related to.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's hard to identify sometimes, because it's like, oh, I'm just being close with my son, or I'm just being close with this good friend who's like part of our family. He's like a brother, but it's like, well, is he? You know, like, I think it's harder to identify, because you're not like, you had sex, that's bad, or you did some illicit activity together. Yeah.
Yeah. There's the reason they call it triangulation is because they say like you have 3 points on a piece of paper, and one of them is you, one of them is your spouse, and one of them is this other person, whether it's a child or a coworker or a friend or whatever. And you can be close to that other person, but you just have to make sure that your spousal relationship is closer emotionally. It's kind of like the idea. It's like you can be closer than like you can be closer with a friend than that person is close to their spouse, like over there. But you just have to make sure you're closer to your spouse than you are with anybody else.
Well, I think the hard part of that is usually this happens after some kind of marriage trauma.
Yep.
Yeah.
And there's distance for reasons. You know, it's not just like, I just decided I want to triangulate with this person. You know? So I think it's complicated, and there's
well, and that gets to what I was gonna say is like the cultivating closeness with your spouse is, I think, really important and often neglected as crucial. Like, we kind of have this thing where we settle for like, oh, don't cheat, right? It's like there's actually like that's like the don't do the negative thing, but then there's all these positive things that are part of what marriage is supposed to be. So like say like they talk about like how intimacy is not just physical, but it's also physical. It's like closeness in all its forms, like being close to your spouse intellectually and emotionally and spiritually. And so like I think whatever you can do to cultivate closeness in all the areas is actually a really
I think
thing.
If you think about like obituaries, it's not high praise to say my dad never cheated on my mom, or my mom never cheated. You know what I mean? Like, it's like they were a faithful and loving wife / husband / mother, whatever. It's just like, it's all about those positive things. It's not just like, and he never cheated.
Yeah.
The don'ts are a minimum bar.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. So, what about for someone who's in a dating relationship or engaged, or someone who's single? What does it look like for them to keep the marriage bed pure, kind of like with a forward-looking idea?
So I have a little pushback. I think one of my areas where I was tempted with lust early on was partly like, well, I don't know if I'm ever going to be married. So like keeping the marriage bed pure isn't like a motivating factor because maybe I just am never going to be married. So then I can like get out of this. And I think it's much, I think that like the verses that we read, where it's like your body is God's, is like more powerful because you don't know and you're not guaranteed. Like you were talking about the prosperity gospel of sexuality, you're not guaranteed. You could be the most pure, like lust resistant person, and God does not guarantee you a happy marriage in the future. You know, like that's just not part of the
deal.
The deal. I do think it's valuable. I just wanted to put that out there because I do think it can be an area of temptation, and I know it was for me, where I was like, well, I'm not even attracted to anybody.
It's like a rationalization.
So I don't. It's not like I'm like holding out for my husband because I'm not even interested in any of these people. So it doesn't matter what I do. It was like a pitfall for me. Sorry, you can answer.
Yeah, whether in a relationship or single. I mean, I don't know. I was thinking back to like the youth group advice I used to give as a youth pastor here. But like my general rule of thumb, which is really hard to follow, but like it's like kind of like the golden rule applied to a failed relationship. So like hypothetically speaking, if you could choose the boundaries that your future spouse had with their previous boyfriend before you, what would those boundaries be? And I feel like, at least for me, like it's kind of a weird thought, but it's like a helpful way to get at like you're not guaranteed that this relationship works out or whatever. Now this applies if you're in a relationship, not single, but I think it's like doing to others what you would have them do.
Yeah, it's almost like that person is not yours yet.
Yeah, exactly.
Like you're dating, you're not married. So interesting.
Yeah, I think especially for a single, but I think both ways is kind of going back to like the idea where there is a lot of like push of like discovery before you're even hitting puberty in America right now. It's the idea of like you don't want to bring a bunch of friends to your marriage bed in the future. Like it's actually probably preferable that you don't know, like that you haven't discovered much about your sexuality or about like, you know, like those different things, that you haven't done a lot of exploring, because it's a 2-person activity, not a 1-person activity. And so like kind of in some sense being like keeping it pure is like being like, hey, attempting to like not have lots of things to work through in the future.
Yeah.
Because you're going to have to work through all of them.
I think too, there's opportunities that people have to help their friends or relations keep their marriage bed pure. So I think there's like if someone was sharing with you deep things that they hadn't shared with their spouse yet, like kind of putting the brakes on that a little bit and not being like, ooh, I like this deep conversation I'm having with you. Like maybe you should be the one to be like, this is really important. Like you should talk to your spouse about that. Or, you know, like those kinds of things can be, I think, significant.
Yeah. It's even easier to let yourself get away with that when it's like girl talk or guy talk.
Yeah.
When it's like same gender friend, it's like, oh my gosh, my wife did this, my husband did this, and then time out.
Have you talked to them?
Yeah, have you talked to them about this? Yeah.
Or just to be wise. Because sometimes they do need to work it out with somebody, and you can be a faithful friend in that way, but you also, I don't know, kind of like when we were talking about triangulation, sometimes it looks good and feels good to be that insider person when in reality it's not good.
Yeah. I guess even like thinking like if the idea is like that they're one flesh, a friend should be an ally to their marriage.
Yeah.
Before they're an ally to one of them individually.
Yeah.
In some sense.
Putting it.
You know, not saying that they're supposed to like keep people together in an abusive relationship or whatever, but like that their goal is like for their friends to have a healthy marriage, not to have a healthy friendship with that individual person.
Yeah.
This is like a weird sideways answer to your question. I feel like when I was in high school and college, I was very obsessed and focused on who I was going to marry and being in a relationship and wanting that and thinking about it. And I just didn't spend much time actually realizing or living out all of the opportunities that singleness gave.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember actually early on when we were married, like it was not a regret. Like I was so glad we were married. But then watching other young adults do different things, like, oh, like I can't just pick up and go on a mission trip for a half a year. Like we could consider doing that, but that's a very different
It's a very different question.
Yeah, it's a very different question. And I had like a little bit of regret, not of getting married again, but of not taking advantage of my singleness and not experiencing the fullness of the freedom. And then it sounds cliche to say you have so many ministry opportunities, but you sort of do in a way. So I think there can be a danger of just focusing on the don't.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess what I'm saying is like maybe there's something to like, yes, keep the marriage bed holy or keep your future marriage bed holy, possibly, but also like not just the don't lust, don't do this. Like, what can you do at this phase and stage of your life, and dream about that and like that. Is that weird?
No, that's fair. So yeah, our application this week, there's two different things going on in it. One of them is simply to maybe spend some time thinking about whether it be current temptations to lust or past ones, and thinking about and journaling about what emotional things could be underneath that. And the other one is to spend some time praying for the people in your life to be able to resist lustful temptations. So that is what we got for our application. It's a little bit thinking and praying for others and maybe yourself as well.
Mm-hmm. Do you want me to close the prayer?
Yeah, go for it.
God, thank you for this important conversation, and I know it can be sensitive and bring up feelings of guilt or shame, and that can make us just want to kind of almost stop thinking about it. But help us through your Holy Spirit think about ourselves and those around us, and consider how we can encourage those around us to purity, and how you're calling us to purity in all its varied forms, and give us wisdom and direction, Holy Spirit, and openness to what you want to say to each of us. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen.